The morning my parents drove 4 hours to show up at my front gate, they didn't call first. They just appeared on the security camera feed like they always belonged there. My mother in her cream blazer. My father with his hands folded in his coat pockets, both of them staring up at the stone driveway like they were doing slow, quiet math in their heads. I watched them on the monitor for almost a full minute before I said a single word. I didn't reach for the intercom. I didn't call out to Caleb. I just stood there in my kitchen, coffee in hand, and watched the two people who had not come to my wedding, had not called when I miscarried, had not acknowledged our company's first major client. I watched them standing at the gate of the home they never once believed I would have. My name is Nadia Holt. I'm 34 years old. I'm the co-founder of a logistics software company that, as of last fiscal year, cleared just over $11 million in annual revenue. I have a 4-bedroom home on a private lot outside of Burlington, a husband I love more than I can properly articulate, and a life that I built from almost nothing. After the two people standing at my gate looked at my choices and told me, calmly and clearly, that I was making the worst mistake of my life. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've ever been told you weren't good enough by the people who were supposed to love you most, please stay until the end of this, because I want to tell you exactly what happened when I opened that gate. And I want to tell you everything that led to it, because the gate part means nothing without the rest of it. I met Caleb Holt when I was 26. He was working as a junior developer at a small startup, earning maybe $48,000 a year, driving a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked passenger mirror and a back seat full of programming books. He wore the same 3 hoodies in rotation, and he had exactly the kind of laugh that made you feel like whatever room you were in had just gotten warmer. On our 3rd date, he brought me gas station flowers because he'd spent his last $20 on a book I'd mentioned offhandedly wanting to read. He'd written a note inside the cover that said simply, "Thought you should have this." I remember thinking that was the most quietly generous thing anyone had ever done for me. Not showy, not trying to impress, just listening and acting on what he heard. My parents did not share my assessment. My father, Richard Walsh, is a retired commercial real estate broker who built a comfortable life measuring other people's square footage and charging a percentage of their transactions. My mother, Patricia, spent the better part of 20 years curating a social world that revolved around country club memberships, annual trips abroad, and the particular kind of quiet competition that plays out in dining rooms and charity galas, and careful conversations about whose children had done what. They weren't cruel people in the theatrical sense. They didn't shout or slam doors. They were the kind of people who smiled very steadily while saying things that cut straight through you. The kind who asked questions specifically designed to make you feel small and then looked genuinely surprised when you pulled back. The first time I brought Caleb home, my mother offered him coffee and then spent 45 minutes asking about his 5-year plan in a tone that made it clear she found the concept of him having one faintly amusing. My father shook his hand once at the door, spent most of dinner checking his phone, and asked Caleb exactly 2 things over the course of the evening: what kind of car he drove, and whether the startup had outside investors. When Caleb said they were still in early-stage funding rounds, my father made a soft sound and said, "Interesting," in the specific way people say interesting when they mean the opposite. I noticed all of it. I always noticed. But I was 26 and in love, and I had convinced myself they just needed time with him, that once they saw what I saw, they'd come around. They didn't need time. They needed him to be a different person. 6 months later, when Caleb and I got engaged, I called my mother from the parking lot of the jewelry store. The ring was simple, a small oval stone set in gold, chosen because it was the one I'd quietly pointed to 3 weeks earlier when we'd been walking past a shop window. He remembered. Of course he remembered. I was still holding the little velvet box when my mother went quiet on the phone. So quiet, I thought the call had dropped. And then she said, very carefully, "Nadia, I really need you to think about the life you're choosing. Not congratulations. Not, I love you, sweetheart, I'm so happy for you." Just a measured, controlled sentence, wrapped in the language of concern. I told her I had thought about it, that I was happy, that Caleb was exactly who I wanted to build a life with. She said, "People don't build lives on potential, sweetheart. They build them on results." I remember going quiet at that, not because I agreed with her, but because I was surprised by how clean the line was, how rehearsed it felt, like she'd had it ready. I should have understood then what I was dealing with. But hope makes you patient with people longer than patience actually serves you. The final dinner, the one where everything broke open, happened 3 weeks before our wedding. My parents had agreed to come over to try. That was how my mother framed it on the phone. "We're willing to try, Nadia." As though making an effort to know the man I was marrying was an act of considerable grace on their part. It started quietly enough. My mother asked about the venue. I told her it was a small outdoor ceremony at a friend's property. She pressed her lips together in the way I'd seen 1,000 times. A very slight compression, almost imperceptible. My father asked Caleb directly, over salad, what his current salary was. Just like that. No preamble. Caleb looked at him evenly and answered honestly. 53,000, with a small equity stake in the company. My father did something I've never forgotten. He made a quiet sound through his nose, not a full laugh, just a breath. Dismissal in exhale form. I felt it land in the middle of my chest, like something physical. Caleb didn't flinch. He looked my father in the eye and said, "I know it's not where I want to be yet, but I know where I'm going." My father picked up his fork and said, "Sure." By the main course, my mother had pivoted to discussing my cousin Renata's husband, a cardiologist, and their new property in Scottsdale. The message wasn't even subtle. It was a billboard planted right in the center of my dining table. I put my fork down. I looked at both of them, and I said, clearly and without heat, "I'm marrying him. And I need you both to decide right now whether you're going to be part of my life going forward. But I'm done sitting here while you audition him," my father said. "Then don't expect us to show up and pretend we're happy about something we're not." I said, "I'm not asking you to pretend anything." That was the last real conversation I had with them for a long time. They did not come to the wedding. My father texted the morning of, one sentence, formal, wishing us well. My mother sent a card 3 weeks later. The card said she hoped I'd be okay and that they would be there when I came to my senses. I read it once, placed it in the kitchen drawer. We kept miscellaneous things in and never responded. 5 years of near silence followed. A birthday text. A 2-line message when my grandmother passed. Surface contact from people waiting for me to fail. I felt it in every message, or rather, in the space between the messages. That patient, quiet waiting. If you've been in that position, you know exactly what I mean. That specific kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being watched by people who are hoping you'll stumble. But I need you to stay with me. Because what happened when they showed up at my gate is the part of this story that I've needed to tell for a long time. And it starts not with triumph, but with a question I asked myself when I saw them on that camera screen. A quiet, honest question. Why now? I looked at Caleb. He was standing next to me with his coffee, watching the monitor. He glanced over at me and said, simply, "Your call. Whatever you want to do." I looked back at the screen. At my mother in her cream blazer. At my father, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving slowly across the property. I pressed the button and opened the gate. If you want to know what happened next, stay with me. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do hit that button and the bell so you don't miss where this goes. They walked up the driveway slowly. I watched them through the front window before I opened the door. Just for a moment. Just long enough to read them the way I've learned to read people over years of negotiating contracts and managing difficult clients and building something from nothing in a world that doesn't always want to let you. My mother's eyes moved across the property steadily. The landscaping, the stone facade, the 2 cars in the driveway. My father's posture was careful, straighter than I remembered it. The posture of someone in a meeting they want to go well. I knew that posture. It was the one he used when he needed something. I opened the door before they could knock. My mother's face did something complicated when she saw me. Not quite guilt, not quite pride, not quite the warm reunion expression she had clearly practiced arranging. It was all 3 things arriving at once, and none of them landing cleanly. She said my name, Nadia, and opened her arms, and I stood in the doorway for just a breath of a moment before I stepped into the hug. Because even now, even with everything sitting between us, she was still my mother. The body carries things, the mind tries to organize. I let her hold me for a second, and then I stepped back. My father extended his hand. He shook mine, firm and brief, like I was a colleague. He respected, but didn't know well, and then his eyes moved past me into the house. Not rudely, not obviously, just a glance that took in the entryway, the floors, the staircase. Measuring. Still measuring, after all of it. He said, "This is a beautiful home." Not, "Hello." Not, "I've missed you." Not, "I'm sorry." 5 words of appraisal. And somehow that told me everything I needed to know about how this visit was going to go, if I let it go the way they'd planned it. I brought them inside. Caleb came out of the kitchen, and there was one of those suspended moments where everyone in the room is deciding what face to wear. My mother kissed Caleb on the cheek, something she had never done before, not once, in all the years he'd been in my life. My father shook his hand, both hands this time, a real grip. He said, "Good to see you, son." Actually said son. I kept my face still. Caleb thanked him smoothly and offered coffee and disappeared back toward the kitchen with the easy grace of someone who was giving us the room intentionally. I sat across from my parents in the living room I had designed myself, the furniture chosen piece by piece, the bookshelves built to order, the light in the afternoon coming through windows I had picked, and I waited. I've learned that waiting is a skill. Most people can't tolerate silence long enough to let the other person arrive at what they actually came to say. My mother started with the drive. Traffic on the 407, a restaurant they'd tried recently in the city, something about a neighbor's renovation project. Small, careful conversation that circled the entire perimeter of what actually needed to be said without touching it once. I let her talk. I asked a question or 2. I was present without being eager. It took 12 minutes. I counted internally, almost without meaning to. My father set his coffee cup down and said, "We wanted to come see how you were doing. We realized we'd let too much time pass." I said, 5 years. We know. My mother's voice was softer than I remembered it. "And we're not proud of that." I nodded. I said, "I'm glad you're here." And it was true in the limited way things can be true when they're also incomplete. What happened next was subtle. My mother asked to use the restroom. When she came back, she mentioned, almost as a passing observation, that she'd noticed the office down the hallway. "Is that where you work from home?" she asked. And then, lighter, as though she'd just thought of it. "Caleb's company did well. We heard through your aunt there was some kind of acquisition." And there it was. Not a casual comment. Sourced information, carefully introduced. They knew about the acquisition, the partnership deal we'd closed 8 months earlier that had been covered in 2 local business publications and 1 trade newsletter. They had done their research. And they had timed their visit to a specific window, not randomly, not out of sudden guilt alone. My Aunt Sonia was my mother's younger sister. We'd stayed loosely in touch across those 5 years, holiday texts, a call here and there. She was kind and she meant well, but she repeated what she knew. Apparently, what she knew had made its way back to my parents in enough detail that they'd decided this was the moment to come. I kept my face neutral. I said, "Things have been going well, yes." My father leaned forward slightly. "That's wonderful, Nadia, truly. We always knew you were capable." I almost smiled. We always knew. 5 years of silence, and they always knew. I excused myself to refill the coffee and walked into the kitchen where Caleb was at the counter, arms crossed, already reading my face the way he's always been able to. Not intrusively, not loudly, just there and attentive. "They know about the acquisition," I said quietly. "I figured." A pause. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking they came with something specific. I'm thinking I need to let them say it." He nodded. He didn't add anything. That's the thing about Caleb that people who underestimated him never understood. He doesn't fill space with noise. He leaves room for what's actually needed. I took the coffee back out. I sat down. I started listening at a deeper level. My mother began talking about my grandfather's estate. It came out slowly, wrapped in family history and memory. She mentioned that he had passed 8 months ago. I knew. My aunt had texted, and I had sent flowers and lit a candle, and grieved privately in the way I'd learned to process family things during those years of distance. What I hadn't known, what I was about to find out, was what had been inside his estate. My mother said there had been some complications with the will. There was a property in Hamilton, a commercial building, fully tenanted, generating solid rental income that had been left partially to me. I went very still inside. Not from shock exactly, more from the specific feeling of something shifting into focus. She said the property had recently been appraised. She delivered the number with practiced steadiness, the calm of someone who had rehearsed not reacting to it. $1.4 million. My share was 35%, just under $500,000. And then she said, she and my father hoped we could all align on a decision about the estate before too much more time passed. There was a tenant issue. Legal complications. The 3 inheritors needed to agree. She said it all, so reasonably, so warmly, and I sat and listened, and under the surface of my expression I was asking the one question she had not answered. Why had 8 months passed without anyone telling me? I thought about my grandfather a lot that night. Gerald Walsh, retired civil engineer, crossword puzzles, and instant coffee, and westerns he'd seen so many times he could quote them. A quiet man who said little and meant what he said. A man who, every single year on my birthday, through the engagement, through the wedding he hadn't attended, through the years of silence with my parents, had called me without fail. Always the same. Just checking on my girl. Not a long call, sometimes 10 minutes, but real, present, him on the other end, listening. I understood those calls differently now. I called my Aunt Sonia that evening after my parents left to their hotel. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table and called her directly, without warming up to it. "Were you aware," I asked, "that I hadn't been told about the estate?" A pause. "Nadia, I thought you knew." Her voice was careful, which meant she hadn't thought I knew. "I asked when the will had been read," she told me. 8 months ago. And then, very slowly, she said there had been some discussion about the property, about whether the situation could be, as she put it, simplified. "What does simplified mean?" I said. She was quiet for long enough that I could hear her deciding something. And then she said that my mother had suggested, in the early weeks after my grandfather's death, that since I had been out of contact with the family, it might be more practical for my share to be absorbed back into the general estate. That I would probably prefer not to be involved. That it would be cleaner for everyone. I sat with that. My mother had told the estate lawyer, her sister, and apparently anyone who would listen, that I would prefer not to be involved in my own inheritance. She had spent 8 months attempting to quietly fold my 35% into the portion she controlled. The problem, the only problem, was that you cannot remove someone from a will without their explicit written consent. The estate lawyer had pushed back, had told my mother clearly that my grandfather's wishes were documented and legally binding, and that I had to be formally contacted, that there was no mechanism to proceed without my signature. And so here they were. Cream blazer. Weekend bags at a nearby hotel. Pastries from a good bakery. Sudden warmth? I didn't say anything for a moment. I just sat with the information, the way you sit with something heavy before you figure out where to put it. And then I thought about my grandfather writing my name into that document, sitting somewhere at some desk with his methodical engineer's mind, deliberately making sure that no matter what happened between me and my parents, I would not be erased. I thought about what that had cost him. Not financially, but personally. He had made a choice that he knew would create tension with his daughter, and he'd made it anyway. Quietly. Without telling me. Without needing me to thank him. Just, "This is yours. I'm making sure of it." Just checking on my girl. I did not cry. I had spent a long time getting past the kind of pain that needed tears to move through me. But something settled deeply in that moment. Something that had been unresolved for years found its shape. I asked Sonia for the estate lawyer's name. She gave it to me quickly. And then she said, "I should have called you sooner. I'm sorry." I told her she was helping now, and that it counted. I stayed up late that night with my laptop, reading through what I could find on estate partition law in Ontario. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm someone who knows how to research and how to understand a document when the stakes are real. And by the time Caleb came to check on me around midnight, I had a clear enough picture to know what my options were. He sat across from me and looked at what was open on my screen. He didn't ask me to slow down, or to wait, or to consider being more forgiving. He just asked, "What are you going to do?" I said I wanted to talk to the estate lawyer first, and then our own legal counsel. He said, "Okay, do you want me there for the calls?" I said no, I needed to do it alone. He nodded. No argument, no wounded look, just, "Okay, I'll make breakfast." Early start. That's who he had always been. That's who my parents had looked at and found insufficient. The call with the estate lawyer the next morning was brief and clarifying. David Park had a calm, precise manner, and he didn't dramatize anything. He confirmed the timeline. He confirmed that as a named beneficiary, I had full rights to my portion of the estate, independent of the other inheritors' preferences. He confirmed that I could request a partition, a formal separation of my share from the joint estate, and either take my percentage of a future sale or request a buyout at appraised value if the others didn't want to sell. He also said, carefully, that there had been some communication with one of the other beneficiaries about the possibility of consolidating the estate. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. I thanked him and made the second call to our company's legal counsel, a woman named Ria Banerjee, who had been with us since the early days and who I trusted completely. She walked me through the partition request process, confirmed it was straightforward, and said she could help me draft the necessary documentation. We scheduled a call for the following week. By the time my parents knocked on the door Saturday morning, I had everything I needed. Not to punish them, not to win, just to be clear about what was mine and what I was going to do with it. There's a difference between strategy and revenge. Revenge is reactive. Strategy is knowing what you want and moving toward it without letting the other person's behavior determine your direction. I had spent 5 years learning that difference. Building a company teaches it to you whether you want to learn it or not. I looked at Caleb across the kitchen counter before I opened the door. "Ready?" he said. "Yeah," I said. "I think so." I had made a decision before they arrived that morning. I was not going to lead with emotion, not with the grief of the missed wedding, not with the months of silence after my miscarriage, not with the anger of finding out my mother had spent 8 months trying to absorb an inheritance that my grandfather had specifically made sure reached me. I was going to lead with clarity, calm and specific clarity, the kind that doesn't need volume to land. I'd watched enough difficult conversations go wrong because someone walked in, leading with the wound instead of the truth. I'd sat across from vendors and partners and investors who had underestimated us, and the ones we'd handled best were the ones we'd approached with complete composure and complete information. You don't need to be angry when you have facts. The facts do the work. So when my parents came back Saturday morning, I offered them breakfast. I brought them to the kitchen, not the living room. The kitchen felt more honest. No performance space, no careful furniture arrangement, just a table and chairs and daylight coming through the window over the sink. Caleb made eggs and moved around the space, naturally, unhurried, present without hovering. He knew everything. I had told him all of it the night before, and he had listened and then asked, simply, what he could do. I told him just to be there. That was all I needed. My mother had brought pastries. She set the box on the counter with the slightly tentative air of someone trying, and I thanked her and meant it. Small gestures are still gestures. I have never been someone who dismissed the effort of a small gesture simply because it arrived late. We ate for a few minutes, made the kind of conversation that happens when everyone in the room is thinking about something different. And then my father put his fork down and said, "We were hoping we could get further into the estate conversation today, before we head back." I said, "I'd like that. I spoke with David Park yesterday." The shift in my mother's face was small, a brief stillness in the muscles around her eyes. My father's posture changed slightly, a minor recalibration. They had not expected me to have moved that fast. "He was very helpful," I said, keeping my voice even and steady. "He explained the full situation, including the timeline of notifications." A pause. I let it sit for exactly long enough. I wasn't aware that 8 months had passed since the will was read. I would have appreciated being contacted sooner. My mother said, "We were trying to figure out the best way to approach it. It's not a simple situation. It's actually somewhat straightforward. I said, without sharpness. My name is in the will. It has been since my grandfather wrote it. Mr. Park confirmed that the estate was legally obligated to notify me within a reasonable time frame, and that the delay had created some procedural complications he had to navigate. Another pause. He mentioned there had been some early discussions about consolidating the estate. Simplifying it, was how he put it. The kitchen was very quiet. My mother looked at me steadily. She is not a woman who collapses under pressure. She never has been. But the performance, the warm, carefully maintained surface, got thinner. I could see her recalculating. She said, "We should have called you sooner. You're right, and I'm sorry for that." I nodded. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." And then I said the part I had been building toward, the part I had organized carefully the night before, clear and specific, and delivered without heat. I said, "I've thought about what I want to do with my portion of the estate. I've decided I don't want to be part of a joint decision on the property. I want to separate my share and manage it independently." My mother blinked. "Is that something you can do?" "Yes. It's called a partition." Mr. Park confirmed. "It's legally straightforward. My 35% is mine. I can request that my interest be separated and either take my proceeds from a future sale or have the other beneficiaries buy me out at the appraised value if they'd prefer to hold the property." My father said, "Nadia, that's not the most practical approach for everyone involved." "I'm not looking for the most practical approach for everyone," I said quietly. "I'm looking for what's right for me." The silence that followed was the real conversation, the one underneath everything. I looked at both of them. Not with coldness, I want to be clear about that. I was not trying to make them small. I was not interested in humiliating them at my kitchen table. I had thought about what I actually wanted from this moment, and it wasn't theater. It was honesty. Real, uncomplicated, long overdue honesty between people who had spent 5 years performing carefully around each other from a distance. I said, "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as something, not as an attack." They both went still in the particular way people go still when they know what's coming. Has been a long time building. I said, "I know why you came this weekend, and I think part of it was genuine. Part of it was about actually wanting to close some of this distance. I believe that. But I also think part of it was the acquisition and the estate, and the fact that both of those things together made this particular moment feel like the right time to reconnect in a way that other moments over the last 5 years didn't." I let that land. I'm not saying that makes you bad people. I'm saying I see it. And I think we're past the point where we need to pretend otherwise. My mother's eyes were wet, not dramatically, just the particular brightness that comes before tears that a composed person won't let fall. She said, "We were wrong about Caleb, about what you were capable of, about all of it." I said, "I know." My father said, "You built something extraordinary." I said, "We did, Caleb and I, together." He nodded, and he looked, for the first time in all the years I could remember, like a man who was putting something down rather than picking something up. Whatever it was, it seemed heavy. Guilt, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of having been wrong for a long time and knowing it and not having a clean way to say so. I said, "I'm not closing the door. I need that to be clear. I'm not shutting you out. But things have to be different. I'll handle the estate partition myself, cleanly, without dispute. And in terms of us, what we're doing here at this table, I need it to be real. I need it to be honest, because I'm too old, and I've worked too hard to spend energy on performances." Caleb came and stood beside me, not in front of me, not between me and my parents, just beside me, where he has always been. My parents left Sunday afternoon. The visit ended the way real things end. Not with a dramatic scene or a tearful reconciliation or a door closing hard on its frame, but with two people carrying their weekend bags to their car and my mother turning at the bottom of the driveway to look at me one more time before she got in. She said my name. Just that. Nadia, with something in it that was different from the way she had said it when she arrived. I raised my hand. She got in the car. They drove away. I stood in the doorway for a moment after their taillights disappeared at the bend in the road, not replaying the weekend, not building a speech I should have given, just standing there in the early afternoon quiet of the life I had built, letting it be exactly what it was. In the weeks that followed, I worked with David Park and with Ria to formally separate my share from the joint estate. The process was clean. My Aunt Sonia cooperated fully and without drama. My parents signed what was required without dispute or delay. That, too, told me something. They had come to the table. Once they understood, there was no other option. And they did not make it ugly. I credit them that. The Hamilton property sold in late spring to a developer who had been watching that stretch of road for a couple of years. The building cleared slightly above its appraised value. My 35% came to $482,000, transferred to my account on a Tuesday afternoon in April while I was on a client call. I saw the notification on my phone and I finished the call, and then I sat for a few minutes at my desk with the door closed and thought about my grandfather. I thought about him sitting at whatever desk he used, with his careful engineer's handwriting, putting my name in that document, knowing it might cause tension with his daughter, doing it anyway. Quietly, without announcement, without asking anything from me in return. Just making sure I wouldn't be left out. Just keeping his word to the granddaughter he called every birthday without fail. I don't know if there's a word for that specific kind of love. The kind that protects you in writing before it has to. The kind that says, I see you, and I'm making sure you're accounted for even when I'm not here anymore. I've tried to find the right word for it, and I keep coming up short. Maybe it doesn't need a word. Maybe it just needs to be felt. I put a portion of that inheritance into an accelerator fund for Caleb's next project, something he'd been sketching out for 2 years, a platform concept he'd been too careful to pull resources toward while we were still stabilizing the first company. Now we had runway. Now he could move. I told him over dinner on a Thursday night, pushing a piece of paper across the table with the number on it, and watched him go very still the way he does when something is more than he expected. He looked up at me and said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know. That's why I wanted to." Some of it went to savings. Some of it went into a real estate investment we'd been watching. And a portion, not a small one, went to a scholarship fund for first-generation university students in Ontario, the kind of program that tells 18-year-olds that where they start doesn't have to determine where they finish. I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. It was the right place for that money, and my grandfather would have understood that without me explaining it. Here is what I want to say about my parents, now that there is enough distance and enough quiet to say it honestly. They were wrong about Caleb. Completely, absolutely wrong. He was not a risk. He was not a placeholder or a phase or a man to be tolerated until I came to my senses. He was the most quietly capable, most fundamentally decent person I had ever sat across from. And the years proved that without needing me to argue it once. The company we built, the decisions we made together, the way he showed up on the nights we weren't sure we were going to make it. That's who he was at 26, too. My parents just couldn't see it because they were measuring the wrong things. They had a very specific ruler, and it only measured certain kinds of worth, and everything it couldn't measure it dismissed. But here is the harder thing I have had to sit with. My parents are not villains. I've gone back and forth on how to frame them in my own mind, and I keep arriving at this. They are people whose love for me was real but limited. Limited by fear? By the specific shape of the world they'd built? By a need for a version of security that could be quantified and compared and displayed. They couldn't see past what Caleb didn't have. They lacked, in that specific way, imagination. And that's not the same as cruelty, even though it felt like cruelty for a long time. It felt like being told you weren't worth believing in by the very people whose job it was to believe in you first. That's a loss. A real one. I'm not going to minimize it or dress it up as a lesson I'm grateful for. Losing 5 years with your parents because they couldn't see past a man's salary is a real thing to lose. I missed my mother at my wedding. I missed being able to call my father when things got hard in the early days of the business and have him say something useful. I missed being able to share the wins as they came. Those are actual absences, and they left actual marks. What I can say is this: the absence clarified things. It showed me exactly who I was building for and why. It removed the weight of needing approval from people who had attached their approval to conditions, and it let me move faster and further than I might have if I'd spent those years trying to earn my way back into their good opinion. I am not grateful for the pain, but I'm clear about what it produced. My mother called on my birthday this past year. No estate paperwork, no logistical reason attached. Just a call. She asked how I was, and when I answered, she listened the way someone listens when they actually want to know. We talked for almost an hour, and it was still careful in places, still new, still finding its footing. But it was real. When we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while and let myself feel all of it at once. The relief and the grief and the cautious, fragile opening of something that might eventually become what it should have always been. Caleb walked in and saw my face and sat down across from me without asking anything. After a while, I said, "She called." He said, "I heard a little. Sounded like a good one." I said, "It was. It really was." He reached across the table and took my hand. And that was it. That was the whole moment. That was enough. If you're watching this and you've been told you're not enough by someone who was supposed to be the first person to believe in you, I want you to hear this clearly. Their measuring stick was wrong. Not slightly off. Wrong. The things that matter about a person cannot be appraised. The things that make a life worth living are not visible in the first impression or the bank statement or the car in the driveway. They are visible in what someone does when things are hard, in whether they show up, in whether they listen, in whether they bring you a book because you mentioned it once and they were paying attention. You don't need permission to build the life you're after. You don't need anyone's approval to love the person you've chosen. And you don't need to wait until the people who doubted you are standing at your gate to know that you made the right call. You just have to build it. Keep building it, and trust the person beside you who believed in it first. If this story reached something in you, please leave a comment below. I would genuinely love to know your experience if you've ever been here. Whether someone underestimated you or the person you loved, what you did, how it went. Those comments mean more than you know. Please like this video if it connected with you. It helps this story reach someone who might need it right now. Share it with someone who's in the middle of their own version of this and needs to hear that there's a part 5 to their story too. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There's more here. And I'm glad you stayed. Take care of yourselves and keep building.